I'm not sure if I'm cool. We'll start. But the first thing I have to do is I'm somewhat embarrassed. As I was setting up earlier, I realized I'm actually wearing the same outfit as my avatar. That was, I assure you, was unintentional. But I'm happy to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about technology, and I'll take a different spin on it. One of the interesting things about conferences like these is we hear a lot of people who would pretty much nod their heads, things that we agree with, and all the speakers I've seen today say the same things I will say to you, etc. But I'm going to do it a couple of different ways. I'm going to ask questions throughout. As opposed to tell you what I think is happening or what's going on in education, I'm going to raise questions that we should ask, and we should constantly ask as we think about technology's role. And I've been at Microsoft for many years and visited schools and worked with schools in 115 countries all over the world. And I can tell you from my lens, technology is really just a vehicle to show us how far we haven't come as opposed to how far we've come. When we think about technology, we use words like innovation in the future, etc. I think we're grounded in the past as it relates to education and technology's role. And I think the both of them can grow, but we've got to do some work to get there. And when technology enters our schools, our classrooms, typically the questions start in service of devices and technology. We set up smart boards, devices, iPads, etc., and then we ask ourselves, how do we get them to work? How do we use them? How do we find content to make it happen? And we've got to be in service of our students and teachers every day and not in service of the devices, and that will filter a lot of the conversations as we get to. Now, we've often heard classrooms described as airplanes, where students file into their seats. They face the front, and they're told to put their devices away and fly off. In many cases, that happens. But I want to ask us a first question around technology and education. In the world of technology, where all of you are holding devices that can get out to the internet, search websites, etc., you can Google or Bing or what have you to get any information you have. When we think about technology, we often iterate on the what. What are we using? How are we using it? How do we plug it in, etc. We often don't think about how learning is advanced. So envision this scenario. I was going to hand you a test, a multiple choice test about a subject that you don't know anything about. And with the devices in your hand, how many of you think you could pass that test? And in many cases, what happens in a classroom is teachers teach with technology and use technology and learn technology, and then the test happens and technology is forbidden. And that's a reflection both on the test as well as the technology. What we're learning hasn't changed. How education at its core has evolved hasn't changed. We're spending our time with devices and smart boards and technology in service of what? Advancing students in the workplace, advancing students' potential. And technology, a tool for that advancement, has to fundamentally change what we're teaching, what we're learning, what we're assessing. And that's not happening in a broad way around the world, and that's something we've got to move on to. I would say, as it relates to technology, we're certainly at the end of the beginning. And the next phase is going to have to be asking questions. So when I take that test away, the technology should be porting the learning. It's like asking a doctor who uses scalpels and EKGs and X-rays to evaluate a patient's health, going into an operation with their bare hands to operate on a patient. We've got to use technology as a tool for learning and certainly move on. Now, certainly we've seen images of the classroom, and the lens of the classroom as sort of something that hasn't changed in 100 years is true. I want to spin it to what I really think is at the heart of a lot of this, is the sort of the pivot on education. In the olden days, education existed for two purposes, either for class distinction and culture, aristocracy, etc., or to get a skill, to be an apprentice. Today, our classrooms are filled with sort of both things happening at once. Students aren't sure where they're preparing. And when I look at classrooms that are preparing folks for workplaces that have fundamentally evolved and changed the way the dynamics are, we look at these classrooms today and we say, these classrooms are failing us. They haven't changed, they haven't evolved, etc. The reality is what's going on in the classroom is the most important thing, not the classroom itself. We can put in many devices and make a nice, fancy picture with round tables, etc. We've got to fundamentally think about what we're teaching. And that's a question that we have to ask constantly. We've done work with students all over the world, and what happens, the best class to attend, and I often like to be, first week of the school year, all around the world, I typically go to the algebra classes. And I sit in the classroom and see students in algebra classes, and invariably some kid in the classroom in every country around the world will raise their hand and ask, what does this have to do with the real world? And in many cases, that student hunger for relevance drives students' connection not only to why learning matters, but how they're going to use it in the real world to get ahead, to get a job, to realize their potential. And as learning gets more and more theoretical, you go from earth science to biology to chemistry to physics, the students constantly question where their relevance is connected to the real world. And in many ways, the workforce has evolved to a point where technology not only can fuel that experience, but the way in which students build skills is increasingly needed by our professions, our employers, et cetera. So technology has got to help serve that, but in a different way than it's serving today. If you look at the continuum of education, there have been many stages from the industrial age, which sort of sparks not only the growth in GDP around the world, but the real introduction of technology. For the last, really, many, many years, we've been on a quest for automation. And that's really been what I would define this age that we're coming to an end on is automation, where we've taken traditional vehicles, not only traditional content vehicles, traditional instruction vehicles, and automated them. We've got virtual lectures, virtual courses, virtual books. And we haven't really fundamentally explored not only the teaching methodologies, but what we're teaching and why we're teaching it. And that rooting in relevance is critical. And that's an important step as we go on this journey. Now, despite what you may think, Microsoft employees aren't allergic to Apple devices. And certainly, the reality is this is a great example of the power of automation and the reality that we have to start to think about how we take great devices like this and question why we're learning in certain ways. Now, many of you have seen digital readers where we've got books on a shelf, and we often celebrate the fact that it looks like a book and it looks like a shelf. We've got to start to wonder why we celebrate the turning of a digital page and ask ourselves, why do pages exist in a digital form factor? Or is there other ways to navigate? Is there other ways to consume content and information? This is an example of the automation pinnacle. We've gotten to a point where we're automating experiences. Wikipedia is another great example. Now, many of you are teachers. You probably have put computers in your classroom, and you've been asked, how has it impacted learning? Now, when you've got access to information, when you've got access to a digital book, it doesn't make anyone smarter. And I think I die a little bit inside when I see stories about technology and devices and computers have helped students, improve on test scores. I just saw something yesterday. Devices improved test scores by 20%. And to me, I don't know about any device with magical powers, but fundamentally, devices didn't do anything. The students may have been more motivated to learn. The teachers may have been more excited about the experience. The content may have been better. But the students improved learning. Technology served that journey, and that's what we have to constantly question. Wikipedia is a great example. There's great content digitally, and a kid who didn't have access to this has all the tools in the world, but doesn't make them smarter, doesn't make them along the journey. And when we think about technology, companies like Microsoft have to ask ourselves how technology can best serve that experience. So I'm going to give you an example. This is something I pulled up on Wikipedia. This is US incarceration rates. So I can find out a lot of information. If anyone wants to know, in the year 2005, there were 2.3 million Americans incarcerated in the United States. And I can find that information here. I didn't know that fact. I go into this page. It's wonderful. It's a breakthrough technology that didn't exist before, but it doesn't advance my understanding or appreciation emotionally as it relates to that subject. Here's another example of using technology to serve not only a different appreciation of learning, but emotional connection. As technology companies, we often don't use the word emotion and mood too often as it relates to learning experiences. It's something we have to do more. Because that, as you think about technology as serving the learning journey and bringing an emotional connection to what we're learning is incredibly important. Chris Jordan is an artist, and it's an important word, artist. As we think about technology, we don't think about technology and art coming together, but it certainly is at the time to think about that differently. He has an example of 2.3 million prison uniforms stacked on top of each other. So if I click this slide, you'll see an example of 2.3 million uniforms folded on top of each other. And as this zooms in, you're getting an experience, and you can go on the website, chrisjordan.com, and see many, many examples of data connecting. You're getting an experience of what 2.3 million things looks like. And that may give you an emotional connection, a visual representation of something that wasn't possible just on that Wikipedia page. And as we think about technology, technology should do more of this than more of the automation thing. We're done with the automation thing. We've got to get to a point where technology advances the emotional response. And I'm going to talk a lot about game-based learning. The game trajectory for many things in technology is always a good lens to think about how far we're coming. It's often driven the technology advances, et cetera. And games are undergoing a similar thing. If you thought about the original games, things like Pong, which was an automation of tennis, although it may be hard to imagine, the game journey was often a quest for realism, graphic fidelity. We wanted to make it look like the real world. Many games today are focused on emotion. They're focusing on art and a mood. Games are scary, games are funny. And games are often retro, where game publishers, with the tools and the graphic power that they can deliver realism, are often stylistically choosing not to. It's an artistic gesture, and that's the kind of application we have to get to, not only with our learning materials, but the way in which we use technology to serve the learners. So immersive experiences exist, and certainly there are many, many different examples. I'm going to show a couple of examples of the way in which the physical world is connecting to the virtual world. Powerful examples where I can use sensor technology and visual technology to actually physically interact with experiences that I couldn't get with just traditional technology or automation technology. And there are many, many different projects all over the world where these experiences are becoming real every day, where I actually take cameras and interact with my virtual space, where I think about holograms and actually create digital images that I can manipulate with my fingers. So there's a lot of advancement of technology, and what we've got to do is apply these things to create a deeper, connected emotional response, not only to learning, but the learner's world in the real world in terms of relevant experiences. And as it relates to that, I want to talk a little bit about the role of a teacher. Now, the roles of a teacher, and certainly a critical piece of this, and certainly one of the things about education is it's the only industry in the world that the professionals doing education, teachers, are required to be basically superheroes inventing the future in a world just to deliver the minimum expectations. And teachers around the world are doing this in classrooms all over the world. I see it, I visited many of your schools here in the UK, and when that happens, I often get led down a corridor, I open up a school, and I'm amazed by magical experiences. And when I go into those magical experiences, I see a teacher using technology, connecting, in many of the examples shown before. And I'm amazed, I'm impressed, but I often recognize, and I know now because I do this often, I'll go into the classroom next door and it's a completely different experience. Sometimes it's not so amazing, not so magical. And it's because that scale is a problem. And it gets to the point of access, which is a huge issue around education. We've gotten to a point where the digital world has changed learning, and it has to change the way in which we teach and the way in which students prepare for the real world. But access is still a problem around the world. Not every kid is included in this. And along the journey of the education paradigm, you start with the traditional industrial age or in the automation age. When the automation age is done, you notice the access age is very small because we have an imperative now around the world to make access a priority. Once automation stage is sort of proven its case, access becomes a priority. And then when we get to access is where the real work starts, and that's this holistic transformation journey. And all of the presentations you've heard today and yesterday connect to this journey towards holistic transformation, where we reroute education. We think about everything. We question what classrooms look like, what learning looks like, what content looks like, what's the role of a teacher, what's the role of assessment. This journey is hard, and it's going to require innovative teachers. Now, we do learning research all over the world, and what we've learned is, and our previous presenters reflected on this, is that students and teachers pretty much use technology in very basic ways. There are a couple of examples of breakthrough things, but for the most part, people use technology in school and learning like they do everywhere else. And the interesting battle that happens and the warfare that happens with learning and education is often one that's connected to a teacher. Now, teachers are asked to often embrace foreign entities coming into computers, smartboards, and figure out how to make them work. Some teachers do. They go through problems and struggles to figure out how to make them work. And others just use it for the basic bare minimum to get the least functionality out of it because they have to teach. They have limited times, limited schedules to deal with. Now, the reality of with teaching, and oftentimes it's blamed on teachers when technology is not working or it's not breaking through. The teachers are older, they don't embrace technology, students learn more, so teachers are fearful. The real thing that's happening in classrooms with technology in our world is the fundamental paradigm of learning has changed. And this is something we've got to embrace across our education classrooms and as part of the teaching profession. Students in the past came to classrooms to learn information. They sat in the room, they found out information from me or from a teacher in the room, and it was a very linear process. I told you what I know, and you write it down, you learn it. Maybe you'll learn a little bit of it, and maybe go on to experience more in your life. Today, kids learn on the internet. They have access to information, they have access to technology. They come into your classrooms with the content already pre-wired. So the fundamental role of a teacher is no longer to deliver information. And that has to be the reality of technology's change. The teacher fundamentally is now changing the way in which the students are learning and the way in which information is received. And that's happening whether they like it or not, whether technology is in the classroom and the learning process or not. And that's the fundamental shift that we have. Now, the reality is it elevates the importance, the need for quality teaching. Technology, on the contrary of making teachers irrelevant, makes teaching and the profession of teaching much more relevant. We're doing a global research survey now, and the results are staggering. When innovative teaching practices are connected without technology, you get great experiences with no scale. When technology is applied without great teaching, you get very little change because students are using the basics. When you've got a great innovative teaching model with great technology implementation, you get scale and change and lasting impact. So the role of a teacher to guide students for the future has never been more critical than it is today, and certainly that's something that we embrace in the work that we do. The other thing that's important is teaching skills. So there's a project going on called ACT21S, which is all about working with countries around the world to redefine how we assess learners, taking the piece of benchmarks from a content-based, subject-based world to assess the learning process. We're learning about history, not to learn about history, to define leadership. We are learning about algebra, not to learn about algebra, but to become more abstract thinkers and abstract learners. And algebra is often the first time abstract thinking happens to a student. They go from a world where it was grounded in the real world, apples plus oranges, or I've got to catch a train and I'm 20 minutes late, etc. When am I going to get on the train? To a world where x plus y equals something. And that shift is something that students aren't prepared for because abstract thinking is never holistically taught into a school. Kids don't go into a session saying, the goal of this class is to make you a more creative thinker or a better leader or a better communicator. They go into the class rooted in subject matter that's often easily replaced with a technology device. So the role of the ACT21S is to advance and lift the thinking beyond the subjects to actually develop and not only build skills, but assess the quality of the education practice by the development of skills on the outcome. That's connected to the end goal. Certainly personalization is important. In Ollie Bray's blog, he talks about students in a symphony. And this is a great example for schools. Students in a symphony in a school are all playing different instruments with different skill levels, with different techniques in the same song, in the same school, at the same age level, etc. And we've got to embrace that as it relates to our learning activities. Now, game-based learning is often talked about as an enabler of this, and this is an important one as we think about technology's role. And Jane McGonigal does a great job of sharing moments like these, which are the wow moments where you see a student light up from a reaction. And I love game-based learning for a couple of reasons. I think it connects to not only students' motivations, it gives them skill development, etc. But I want to really reinforce what I think about game-based learning, which is often not the way it's approached, which is the simulation world. I'm less concerned about that. I know it has value, etc. I care about the bones underneath game-based learning. And the bones of underneath game-based learning is the core incentivization of learning. And that's the important piece that we've got. When you think about games in education, it's not about the learning process, it's about the incentivization of the learning in general. Now, we see students get an F, and this is sort of a demotivating factor. This happens every day for a gamer. The game over screen, loss of life, etc. And the reality is, when I play a game, I know nothing about the game world. When I start playing a game, I die a lot. I learn how the game works, how the mechanics work, how the currency of the game works, etc. And during the course of that game, because the gameplay itself incentivizes my learning, I become an expert. By the end of the game, I know everything about the world. I know how to manipulate the tools. I know how to use the machine of the game to win. And I may have had a different learning path than you or you or you, because the gameplay allowed us to experiment, to live inside of that game world. The traditional learning environment, which is built on content and retention and assessment, is a very linear path. And I may tell you about something, and you may learn exactly the same thing I told you, but it's going to be a very straight path. Gameplay, the bones underneath game-based learning, are important. Now, what I would encourage you to do, and this is the easiest place to do it, is service-based activity, volunteerism, project-based activity in the community is the easiest way to apply game-based theory as well as new learning methodologies inside your classrooms. Get kids involved with a project. When you're outside of the reins of the content, you'll be amazed at how free you can be from a learning paradigm. And I've seen the best examples of next-generation learning happen when schools and teachers are away from the boundaries and the specificity of content learning specifically. There are great examples around the world of game-based learning being applied. Jesse Schell, who talked earlier, gave an example at DICE of a Ford Fusion Hybrid 2012 car with a little plant inside the car that grows as you drive efficiently, using game-based theory to actually reinforce good behavior. The Just Press Play example in Rochester with game-based learning theories and achievements rooted into everything from their library to the way in which students learn in portals and their subjects. Examples of creating game-based language that has nothing to do with actually playing a physical game. So there's a lot of opportunities to transform learning and to transform holistic vision. We've got to continue to ask questions, continue to push ourselves, and continue to embrace the power of teachers and be in service of the learners. We talk about devices and phones and slates as amazing, as tremendous portents of the future. I believe students are amazing. Students are the future. And we have to be in a journey to serve them and to serve that mission every day. Thank you very much.